That wasn't my original question, but since you brought it up. In the book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, they're saying that with the invention of language, that's when our consciousness developed. So might that be when the ego came in? Or you're just saying that that's not the way it was?
No, the way to tie that together, now that is not the way it was in my viewpoint. But when you developed language, probably before you developed language, you were self-conscious. I suspect that when you were self-conscious, aware of self existing, a dog is self-conscious. A dog is aware that it exists. It's aware that it is an entity. As soon as you have self-consciousness, then you have a being that can express a consciousness. Okay, consciousness can then use that virtual form, that character that came in the virtual reality. When it becomes self-consciousness, it becomes a suitable host for a character to be played in this game. So I would tend to think that self-consciousness would have been a point where consciousness would have, let me say it differently, when the virtual reality character, us, our bodies, got to the point that they could support self-consciousness, that's probably the point where they became interesting as characters to play by the consciousness system.
Oh. Okay.
Otherwise, they weren't that interesting to play.
Oh, okay. My original question was, can you explain déjà vu?
Well, yeah, generally. Déjà vu is a feeling that you've been there and done that before. It doesn't have necessarily a single explanation. There are a lot of reasons why you may get that. One of the reasons may be that you've been there and done that before. That may be just the reason that you get that. But there's some other reasons too. Sometimes that feeling or sense is given to you just to open your awareness to a larger consciousness system, just as some other paranormal things are given to you, maybe a premonition that comes true, a precognitive dream or something like that. So sometimes you get that sense, because when you have that strong déjà vu sense, you also have a strong sense of your existence and your reality is bigger than just this one. It kind of gives you that bigger picture idea. So sometimes you're given that just to have you experience that bigger picture idea. Sometimes it's because you've been there and done that, and you have experience that's similar to that, and you make a connection. We tend to come up with our metaphors based on pattern matching. That's how our brains work. We match patterns. So something happens, we get some data, we find a pattern that it matches. And sometimes there are no patterns that it matches. Then we match it to the closest possible pattern. We get the best match we can. And then that's what we call it. That's how we interpret it. So some of those déjà vu things, you weren't necessarily just there doing that, but you were in a situation that was very similar, and the patterns kind of didn't fit exactly, but pretty close. So then you get that feeling. So there's a lot of reasons why you might have a déjà vu experience. That's generally true. Usually there's not just a simple answer. Oh, well, that's because of this. That hardly ever happens. Usually there's an array of things that could trigger it.
Tom?
Let's see, I have a question, please. They say that our conscious mind is like the tip of the iceberg, and we know that the subconscious mind is enormous. Do you have a way of measuring that?
I don't know that measuring would be the right word, but that is a true statement. The part of your awareness that I call local awareness, little c consciousness, which is what we're aware of here, is a very small part of your individuated unit of consciousness, and your individuated unit of consciousness is a very small part of the larger consciousness. Now, when you break things into conscious and subconscious, you're starting to talk about Freudian theory, and there's very specific things that belong in the subconscious. Not going to that extreme of definition, but just generally saying you have your awareness of what you're aware of, and then you have everything else that kind of makes up your character. That everything else is a lot bigger. That conscious awareness, that little c consciousness, is kind of a smaller thing.
Tom,
Yes.
I'm really new at all of this, and so forgive the elementary question, but when Bob Monroe stuck his hand in that hole and the hook went through it, did he experience pain?
I'm trying to remember. I know he experienced fear. I suspect he experienced pain because that would have been how he would have interpreted a hook through the hand. My guess is yes, he did experience pain.
And is that generally true then when you're in that situation or condition or whatever?
Well,
however
when you're in those other reality frames, they're just as physical as this frame is physical.
Okay.
They're just different. So yes, when you're in that dream, and something happens to you, you cry and you scream and you feel pain and all the kinds of things that you would do if you were there. Yes, it's again, physical and non-physical is just a perspective of the viewer. So when Bob was in that, as far as he was concerned, that was physical. This reality was non-physical because that's where his focus was. That's the data stream he was hooked to. And when he got that, yes, I'm sure he would have felt pain because that's part of the sensation of having a hook through your hand is pain. So he would have felt pain and he would have felt terror. Something had him.
Okay.
And he would have struggled like a fish to get unhooked.
Right. The other part, when I got here this morning and I saw that you were going to bring science and spirituality together as one, I got really excited because most of my 70 plus years I've believed that I was primarily a spiritual being. And so when I heard that and when I saw that, I was truly excited because I hadn't heard that so much from my son who's been following you for a while. And I didn't see it so much in the book, and I haven't finished it yet. But could you speak to the spirituality and science becoming one? Because I felt like this morning was pretty heavy on science.
Yeah, we are fundamentally consciousness, okay? And a metaphor for that is a spiritual being. We are consciousness. And another metaphor for that would be a soul. Okay, there's lots of metaphors for describing that, but we are consciousness. And as consciousness, that's our fundamental state. That's what's real about us. This physical thing is a schoolhouse, a game we're in to have interactions, to make choices so that we can grow. So where does science come into this? Science comes into this because when you look at reality as a virtual reality, a virtual digital reality, and you look at the experiences that you have in a larger consciousness system, and you look at science with its inability to understand why C is a constant and why particles are probability distributions, and suddenly you see this one overarching set of ideas, and bing, 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 they all drop down. Everything gets explained under this one overarching set of ideas. And one of the things that gets explained is, quantum mechanics and relativity. Another thing is that you are a spiritual being, and that you are one with the larger consciousness. You're netted with all other life, that exists. And as consciousness, you can explore consciousness. You're a piece of consciousness. That gives you that's the doorway. Your consciousness is your doorway to the larger reality because you're a piece of the larger thing. So yes, you've always been a spiritual being. So is everybody else. Most people don't know it. Most people are consumed with their trials and tribulations in this reality. And as well, they probably should be. That's where they're supposed to learn. They're supposed to grow up. But it's not until you grow up to a certain point where you really become aware that you are primarily spirit, consciousness, soul. That's the fundamental thing, that this is not. And of course, what was Buddha trying to explain to everybody? That spirit, soul, consciousness was the fundamental thing, and this was not. That we're all growing toward love. So suddenly metaphysics falls out of it as well. And then all the other little details, the things like backwards causality, and those things get explanations, and why homeopathic medicines work when you dilute till you don't have anything left but water, and why that's stronger instead of weaker, and that kind of all these things that happen, kind of counterintuitive, sort of strange things, become understandable once you get that big picture.